Welcome, 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 friends. I'm TK, your tour guide to the past, and you are listening to For the Love of History, the podcast where we talk about world history, women's history, weird history, and apparently we have turned into Author Central over here because we have our second author interview of the season. I am just absolutely delighted to introduce June Her, coffee addict, author of The Red Palace, and of course, fellow history nerd. Thank you so much for coming today, June.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
We're so excited to have you. I found you on Instagram. There was a really, really cool, if my book was a Netflix, commercial, preview.
Yeah.
That's what the word I'm looking for. And I saw it and I was like, oh, this looks amazing, and thoroughly stalked your Instagram and then went and bought your book.
Thank you. Well, I'm so glad that my Reels works and it reaches out to the right audience that I'm hoping to acquaint with my work. So I'm really glad to hear.
Yeah, the internet works in magical ways sometimes. Mm-hmm. I'm so happy that I saw it. And then I kept seeing more and more of your Reels pop up. And you were talking about different Korean dynasties and different types of writing in how the Korean writing changed to what it is today. And I was like, okay, it's time. I need to email her and ask her if she'll be a guest on For the Love of History. And you said yes, and I'm so happy about that. So the book that we are going to talk about today is The Red Palace. So June has written a few books about Korea and Korean history inspired things. But this one is the newest that just came out in 2022. So can you tell us a little bit about The Red Palace?
Sure. So The Red Palace, it's set in 1758 Joseon, Korea, and the Joseon Dynasty began in 1392 and it ended in 1910. So that's it's like a really long dynasty, and mine is set in 1758. And it's about a palace nurse who teams up with a handsome young police investigator, and they're looking into a series of grisly murders, and then their investigation gets really complicated when the crown prince becomes the prime suspect. Yes. Dun, dun, dun.
Oh my goodness. We don't want to give away too many spoilers because it's a twisty, turny book, and I absolutely love it. I got it on audio version because I needed it immediately. I could not wait. I was listening to it in my kitchen, doing dishes or something, and I realized that I had the water running for 5 minutes, just standing there at the climax of the book, no. And my husband was like, hey, are you okay in there? Oh God. Okay. Yeah, no, I'm fine. The characters that you've built in this book are just so relatable. They're incredibly relatable. And the nurse, please pronounce her name for me. I do not want to mess it up.
Hyun,
yes. I was really happy to have the audio version of the book so I could have all the pronunciations. So Hyun comes from not the best background, and she really truly crawls her way to the top. How did you come up with that character? What was your inspiration?
So for me, it was inspired by my own personal struggles, as an author in the publishing industry. So I've always been super ambitious. I've always, for 10 years, I tried to get published. It didn't work. And so during that time, especially as a young adult, I remember my identity as just an individual got so tied up with what I can accomplish as a writer. And so I look back at that time and I see how toxic it was, because, my worth isn't measured by what I can accomplish. And I think that is something, adults struggle with, but it's also something that young adults and teens struggle with as well. And so I wanted to kind of take that experience that continues to, it's something I'm always wrestling with, and I wanted to take that, and I wanted to kind of structure, like develop a character based on this kind of core like skeleton in the closet of mine. And that kind of shaped into Hyun, who's super ambitious. She wants to, and she places so much of her own self-worth on what she can accomplish, and wanting to like please her father too. And that's kind of parallels with my own life as a teenager, young adult as well.
Yeah, her inner dialogue is so interesting and kind of heart-wrenching at some points. And her relationships with not only her father, but her mother as well, I think really reflect what a lot of young people and adults go through in their life. I know I resonated with her so hard. I was like, oh, Hyun. Same, girl, same. So how did you choose this dynasty, the Joseon Dynasty? What drew you to that particular time period?
So I'm drawn to Joseon Dynasty in general because there's more resources for me to work with. So that's like the general answer. But then specifically, I chose the late, is it early 19th century? Hold on. 1750s. When is that?
18th century.
Yes, 18th century, yes. So I chose
I have to do it as well. All right.
So yeah, I chose the 18th century mainly because I wanted to write a story inspired loosely by the life of Crown Prince Hado. And so I wanted to situate it during the time when it's not too early on where he wasn't going through this where he wasn't in his downward spiral, and I didn't want to set it too late into it where it's like nearing his execution. I wanted to set it kind of like close to the end of his life, but not too close, so that I ended up with 1758, and he passed away in 1762. So yeah, so I ended up choosing 1758, and yeah, like this was a story, like the Crown Prince was a historical event that I always grew up hearing, and but back then I wasn't really interested. I'd be like, oh, who is this? Why do like my parents and other people call him like the rice chest prince? And I kind of shrugged it off, being like, it's weird. And I wasn't interested. But then when I was researching for my first book, I stumbled across the story of Crown Prince Sado, the, quote unquote, the rice chest prince. And then when I read it, I was just like, oh, this is really tragic.
So sad.
Yeah, so tragic. And then I found an entire memoir written by his wife. And that's when I was like, one day I want to write a book about the Crown Prince. I don't know how, but I want to write a book about him. And then that kind of led to the Red Palace.
It's really interesting. You get to see both sides of the palace walls, I guess. Like what life was like inside the palace, and then what life was like for quote unquote normal non-palace people. And it's so fascinating. And I am a huge lover of history, and my degree was in Japanese history, and I never really learned a lot about Korean history. So this book was an absolutely wonderful introduction into Korean history. And do you have any recommendations for people to like get started? So for you, you really not enjoyed, I don't know a good word for what you resonated. You were moved by the rice chest prince story. What other stories that you heard kind of came into the book?
So other stories would be, so it's actually a historical figure named Taejanggeum, and there's also a Korean drama inspired by her life, but Taejanggeum was one of the most like legendary Korean female nurses. And so that's also a story I grew up with, and I didn't really like, when I was younger, like I didn't do research, so I was just like, oh, like kind of shrugged it off. But then when I was doing my research and I studied about these group of nurses called Unya, The more I learned about them, it was just like so fascinating. And I kind of combined my fascination for the rice chef's prince and the system of the nursing system back in the Joseon period, and then kind of combined both my passions into one book.
Yeah, it's incredible. I had no idea that it seemed like the nurses of the Joseon Dynasty were so well organized and really amazing. I had no idea about the pulse reading and all of the other herbalism things. How did you find out information about that?
So I was fortunate enough to have, so there's like this Korean academic resource that was also available through Google Books that I was able to buy. And yeah, it had so many details, like even even medical entries, diary entries from nurses, and it had everything. And I was just like, oh, like I knew how to read Korean enough to access that. And so it's really fascinating because the female nurses, their existence was actually very rooted in like a very patriarchal kind of system, because they were created because they were like, you know what, Korea was back then like very steeped in Confucianism, and so it was very gender segregated. So like male physicians can only touch male patients, and they're not allowed to associate with women. And so you have these female royals passing away and stuff, and female aristocrats, and they're like, and there were even stories of how doctors would try to read a female woman's pulse by tying a string around her and holding it through a veil. And they're because like the women are like, you told us, like the law states women and men are not supposed to associate with each other, and I don't want a male physician, right? Because that's breaking the rule. And so I think it was King Taejo. But yeah, earlier in the Joseon period, a king ended up creating the system of the raising up nurses by bringing in actually servant girls. Yeah, because aristocratic women or middle class women, it's looked down on to be mingling with men and stuff, which is required of nurses. And so you have servant girls being super educated and trained up to become really smart female physicians. And that entire book kind of outlined what their day looked like, about the herbs used, about pulse reading and all that. And so I just like tried to jam in as much as I learned into the book.
I mean, you did an excellent job, as I feel like I know way more about nursing in the Joseon Dynasty than I do now in 2023. It's incredible. So we have this nurse who, for lack of a better phrase, picked herself up by her bootstraps and got into the palace. And then we also have this other character, the dashing, if I might say, police man. Could you let us know what his name is for pronunciation?
Yes, his name is Ojin, and his last name is Ha. So it's Ha Ojin.
Ha Ojin. Yeah. Yes. He the meet cute between Seojin and Hyun is so funny. It's hilarious. And I don't want to spoil it at all because I want you to listen to it or read it, whichever. But it's fantastic. So how did you find that character? How did you come up with him?
So there's a fun story behind that. I actually for the longest time I wanted to write about Crown Prince Hado, but I didn't know how to approach the story. Like I tried writing it through the eyes of the Crown Prince, and I was like, oh, this is really dark. And then I tried to write it through other royals, like princesses or other princes. But I was just like, I just wasn't feeling it, because I'm very into like marginalized voices, like marginalized women. So people who are a bit more at a distance from the royals. So I kind of put the Crown Prince Hado story aside for the longest time until while I was working on my second book, The Forest of Stolen Girls, with my editor. Like she was leaving comments in my manuscript, as she always does. And then in one of the comments, like towards the end, there was this inspector and nurse character that popped up towards the end. And she was just like, oh, like, June, you mentioned you wanted to write a romance one day. It would be so cool to have an inspector and a nurse duo. And then something just sparked in my brain. I was like that is such a fun kind of crime solving duo to have. And then somehow I was just like, oh, like, you know, I could use them to explore the story of Crown Prince Hado. And so that's how the inspector character came to be. And then how I shaped his character was I shaped his character by trying to figure out what kind of guy would Hyun fall for. Like, she would obviously not fall for like an alpha male. She would not fall for someone who is like really mean and disrespects women. I'm like, I need someone who's like very sweet, who has authority to like investigate, but he's like this guy who's just like, oh my gosh, this girl's so smart. Like, I want her to work with me. And so that's how Ojin came to be.
Yeah, he was like, there was moments that I couldn't even handle myself. I was like, oh, Jin, so sweet. And it was so funny and so weird to be like this smitten over a character and then being like, oh, they're investigating the murders of these women. Okay, get it together. Like, but you did that in the most like artful and not, I feel like sometimes romance going on, the romance in the novel is kind of gross. It's too, I don't even know the word for it. It's just too much for what's going on in the story. But in the way you wrote this, you never forget what's happening. Which is exactly like what real life is. You can fall in love with somebody in the most horrible times in your life, but you never forget what's going on, yet you can still fall in love. And I think that it's often forgotten in a lot of murder mystery romance books. So incredible job doing that. That was great.
Phew, I'm so glad.
So my next question for you is, how did you keep all of these characters straight in your brain? How did you build this world? So I know that Joseon Dynasty is a real place, but you had to keep all of this straight in your brain. What was your process? Are you a sticky note gal, or how did you do this?
I always ask myself, why am I doing this to myself? My brain hurts. So there's that. And then I think I'm also an outliner. So I outline chapter by chapter, and then, you know, book by book, I'm starting to figure out, okay, I need to learn how to introduce characters a bit slowly. And so as I'm introducing characters slowly, I get to know the characters myself. But I also use this tool called Scrivener, which is a writing tool, and it allows you to organize your notes. And so I have like this folder of lots of tabs with all the characters that I want involved in my book. And then if I'm not using a character in the end, I just like delete that tab, put it into the trash. But yeah, I have like tabs of all the characters. And so I'll have, you know, like Seojin, and it's like, what kind of, you know, what kind of actor would I cast for him? And like, what is his personality? I also try to like give them one of those, like, put them through a Myers-Briggs test so I can get a more objective idea of like what kind of personality they have.
Smart.
Yeah, and that helps me keep consistent.
Oh my gosh, June, that is amazing. You Myers-Briggs your character.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
But it clearly pays off because each one of your characters are truly their own person and very well developed. I'm not a book critic, but I think I'm pretty good at judging a good book.
I'm so glad to hear
that. Just excellent. Thank you. And then for the storyline, do you use that Scrivener tool for the storyline as well?
So then I use an Excel sheet for the plotting. Scrivener is like, it's good for like drafting and like dumping in information. But then if I want to have something really organized, Excel really helps, because it's like, so a story has a lot of plot beats that I need to meet. So there's like, you know, the setup and like the inciting incident, and then like towards the middle you have like the climax, and then And then right after that, it's like the Dark Night of the Soul. And so there's all these beats. And then next to it, I kind of outline like the plot that kind of encompasses that beat. And so, yeah, it's like just easier to work with, to have like actual cells to write within and move things around and stuff like that.
That is so smart. I'm sure there are some aspiring authors out there who are like, thank you so much. At the beginning of our interview, you were saying that you created the character Hyun kind of not as yourself, but like taking a part of yourself and putting it into a book. Was it kind of cathartic to write this book and these characters in this way?
Yes, for sure. So I think with every book, what keeps me invested in the book is putting my own personal issues like that I want to wrestle with. And I think just writing about just like a girl learning to overcome that kind of ghost of hers, which is, you know, if I don't accomplish things, then I'm not worthy. So I think being able to see her overcome it, it kind of reminds me like, June, you have overcome it before and you can overcome it again. Because it's like, it's not a one-time kind of battle, right? Like it's something we always battle with for the rest of our lives, probably, playing that comparison game. And so having it kind of enshrined within a book, it's like a constant reminder to me, like, you are not, you know, the work that you can produce. And even if you fail, it's okay. Like you can, you know, you're still worthy. You're still, you know, worthy of love, and you and things like that. So in that sense, it's very cathartic. And it's also it was personally, as a history nerd, very satisfying for me, because I was able to parallel what Hyun was going through with her father with what kind of the Crown Prince was going through with his own father.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't writing I wasn't writing a story very close to the Crown Prince. And so I wasn't really able to explore what it was like to grow up with a father who's like so disappointed in you, which was the Crown Prince's life. And so instead of that, I kind of tried to mirror that toxic, abusive relationship in the relationship between the heroine and the father. And so it was cathartic in the sense that we never really see a resolution between the Crown Prince and the king. It just ends up in the king killing his son.
Yeah.
But with Hyun, you kind of see a resolution towards the end of the book. It's bittersweet, but there's a resolution.
Yeah.
And so for me, I was just like, at least there's a resolution in this kind of parallel story that I created.
I'm so interested in Crown Prince Hado and his relationship with his dad. Did everybody really just kind of know that his dad hated him?
Yes. So so Lady Haekyung's memoir, it's like a fantastic memoir, and it's actually one of the rare biographies written by an East Asian woman.
Nice.
To have, so, you know, back then, especially in Korea, like women weren't expected to, you know, write books and stuff. So in her memoirs, she documents the life of her husband, Crown Prince Hado, with a lot of detail. And so she talks about how each time the king would kind of assemble his officials to talk, like her husband Crown Prince Hado would be like, he'd be like, I know they're basically bad-mouthing me and trying to figure out ways to get rid of him, Sado. So he grew up with, the palace was basically against him. There were a handful of people who were on his side, but then over his lifetime, one by one, they all passed away from age. So he was basically alone in the palace. And obviously that doesn't excuse the atrocities that he committed. But I think, it's historical fact. Like his father and officials were against him. So there is this strain among scholars in Korea that have kind of strayed away from seeing him as like this, you know, quote unquote, like this crazy psychopath killer, very problematic term. Like straying away from that and positioning him more as a victim, a political victim. But it is a historical fact though that he was a murderer and he was also a rapist. So it's like, he's like a very taboo, very controversial figure to talk about. It's like, how do you talk about him without romanticizing him or glorifying him, but
Yeah.
also acknowledging that he was a victim of abuse as well.
I like historic fiction sometimes more than like a straight history book, because I think historic fiction allows for that nuance a little bit more. You're not forced to really flatten out the characters as much as I think history, nonfiction history books are not required, but tend to lean towards. So while everything in your book is not 100% accurate, I think we get a really human-like view of these characters and what they could have been like in their real life. I was just talking about this on a previous episode about how people really like to put people from the past in either the villain or the hero categories. And I like that you leave room for the grayness, because there is always grayness in life. And your book is actually the first book that I've ever written.
Sorry. Please write it.
I'll write it for you, don't worry. Your book is the first book I've ever read that is a Korean historical fiction. And I don't know of any other ones out there. So how was that kind of breaking into the publishing world? Like, hey, I have this idea, you know, for this Korean historical fiction. Please publish me. Like, there are so many historical fictions about Western people and things, and not a lot about East Asian or Southeast Asian historical figures. So how was that for you, trying to break into the market?
Initially, I was terrified. And so I first had the idea to attempt to write a Korean historical in 2015. But then I was like, oh, like, I don't see that. Like, I tried Googling and I saw only like a handful of Korean historicals that didn't really break out, or like one or two, just a handful of YA Korean historical fantasies. So I was kind of hesitant for about a year, and then in 2016 I was just like, yeah, screw it, I'm just gonna write it. And I was also encouraged because I saw this whole like we need diverse books movement in the YA sphere. That was encouraging to me. And I'm not sure when Pachinko was written, but I remember like back then, like, I don't think it was, Pachinko was like later on, I think. And so it was kind of like a time when I was like, I didn't see too many Korean historicals. Then it was confusing to me though, because, you know, K-dramas were on the rise, and I saw a lot of people watching, even in the West, people watching Korean historicals, K-dramas. And I was like, so there's like this kind of gap where there is like this huge push in Korean historical media, but then there's like the shelves are empty. And so I was just like, you know what, I'm gonna write the book that I want to read. Like when I'm going through a historical K-drama withdrawal, like I want to be able to pick up a Korean historical book. This is when I go on, like, you know, BBC dramas, like in Britain. Like when I go through BBC withdrawals, like I have tons of like Victorian era mysteries to pick up. And so I just wanted to fill that gap. And then fortunately, because of that push for diversity, that opened a lot of doors for me. And the reception was really good because there are people who want to learn more about Korean history as well. And then from there on, I think there's been so many more. For sure, Pachinko has opened lots of doors for Korean
incredible book. Incredible book.
Exactly. Yeah. So it was daunting at first, but I realized like I didn't have to be too worried.
That's awesome. Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you for writing the book. So throughout this journey of, you know, coming up with the idea, creating the book, drafting, you know, I'm sure there was a lot of work with finding the cover images and, you know, going to events and stuff like that. Has there been a moment where you're just like, wow, this is actually happening? What is going on? Has there been any moments like that?
Um, I think because I published all 3 books in the pandemic, so, so I think it's been kind of like, am I an author? Like, sometimes I'll stare at my book and I'll be like, huh, like those are my books, but it's like this weird, like it's a weird, yeah, it feels like kind of, I feel like very detached in a way. But then recently when I did go to a book event, and there are people coming up being like, can you sign all 3 of my books? And I was just like, oh, okay. So there's like this, it kind of feels, I'm so grateful, but at the same time, it like feels like I'm signing someone else's book.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully I'll get used to it a bit more, that imposter syndrome. Yeah, like when I do get moments of like interacting with readers, like I do feel like so grateful, and it just feels like oh my gosh, like it feels like a dream come true as well.
Oh, I'm so glad. You should have all of those feelings all the time, because this is, I cannot overstate enough how much I love this book, and it was just excellent. So yeah, I highly, highly recommend picking up this book, learning about Hyun's life and the Joseon Dynasty, because it is an incredible introduction into that time period. So before we go today, June, is there any final thoughts that you have for our listeners about the book or anything else?
I would say just thank you so much for listening, and thank you for inviting me. And I can't wait to listen to all your podcasts too, because I'm always like so hungry to learn more about history as well.
Oh, thank you so much, June. And I will put links to all of June's books, not only The Red Palace, but her other ones in the show notes. I'll post it on Instagram, all of that fun stuff. And you can go buy The Red Palace and all of her other books as well. And I will see you in the outro. Well, hello there, my delicious little donut. Thank you so much for listening to episode 98 of For the Love of History podcast. It was an absolute delight to have June on the episode. And again, you can find all of her books and social media in the show notes below. I will link all of them, everything, all of it. Hey, this is Editor TK jumping in here real quick. Thank you so much for your patience with last week's episode and the tiny change in plan for this week's episode. I know I said we were going to learn about the French rat trials, but that'll be next week. So don't worry. Okay, back to regular TK. We are creeping ever closer to episode 100, and if you'd like to participate in the live recording, you can head over to Instagram and submit your questions for me or Mama TK. And you can also slide on into my DMs and ask a question or shoot me an email, whatever works for you. I am so excited for that live episode. I will be going live on either YouTube or Instagram, still trying to figure that out, so stay tuned. And also, don't forget, there will be a giveaway starting this Monday, July 24th, so stay tuned for those details. And with that, I will say adieu, dear one. Don't forget to do something that makes you happy, drink that water, take good care of yourself, and I will see you next week when we, for real, talk about the French rat trials. Okay, love you. Bye.